Hello, and welcome to Story Hour. My name is Rebecca Gomez Farrell, and I am delighted to guest host Story Hour tonight. Welcome back to our returning audience, and welcome to any new listeners we have for the first time. Thank you for coming. So, what's Story Hour? Author Daniel Marcus began Story Hour to raise everyone's spirits during the pandemic by telling each other stories around the virtual campfires of Zoom and Facebook Live. Story Hour co-host Laura Blackwell is also here tonight, running tech behind the scenes. Daniel couldn't join us today, but I am here to guest host, so hey. As always, Story Hour features two writers reading their own complete short stories for your enjoyment. Tonight's readers are Cynthia Gómez and Nadine Aurora Tabing. If you're here with us in the Zoom room, please feel free to use the text chat to express your love for what you're hearing. If you're joining us on Facebook, thank you. Great to have you. But we probably won't see your comments right away, so be aware of that. We will go ahead and dig right in because that's what Story Hour is all about, is listening to wonderful stories from wonderful authors. So our first author tonight will be Cynthia Gómez. Cynthia is a writer and researcher. She writes horror and other types of speculative fiction set primarily in Oakland, where she makes her home. And that's only a couple of towns away from where I make my home, so hooray. Her work has appeared in Fantasy Magazine, Strange Horizons, Tree and Stone, and several anthologies. The Nightmare Box and Other Stories, a collection of very ACAB and Latina fiction, will be out from Dreadstone Press in summer 2024, which is now, so Cynthia will need to tell us more about that. She loves to write dark and frightening things while cuddling with her shadow, aka her adorable little dog. You can find more of her work at Linktree/Cynthia Says Boo, and we will be putting that link in the Zoom chat and on the Facebook page for easy access for folks listening today. So, Cynthia, the floor is yours. Feel free to unmute and get started.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. And I'm going to be debuting a story called Rich Soil, which will appear in August, projected August, in an anthology called Eat the Rich. So, Rich Soil. The man's hair was long and thick and braided like roots and shone like black oil and blood. He worked on the gardening crew of a tech CEO's enormous estate as one of a half-dozen men, constantly pruning and watering and aerating the macadamia groves under the watchful eye of the cameras. The gardener knew just where the blind spots in the cameras were, having been sweating under their gaze for months. In the afternoon shade, he pulled a jar from his bag and sprinkled the contents into the ground above the roots of the largest tree, the one with a scar on its trunk that vaguely resembled a diamond. Then he blended back in with the crew, slightly taller than the rest, walking in and out of the long shadows of the afternoon. Nobody saw what he had done. Nobody could accuse him, later, of having a part in what was to come. The gardener's great-grandfather had worked this land before the island had become a U.S. territory, much less a state. The land had formed part of a collective farm producing ginger, bamboo, taro root. Mushrooms grew in the furrows and the shaded corners. The collective farm had been studded with tiny pockets of land, places where families built simple huts, gathering places for holidays and feasts. Now the huts were gone, the pockets emptied, and the tech CEO had swallowed up hundreds of acres, forming an estate ringed with stone walls and patrolled by roving guards. The CEO's wealth had come from a website he'd launched as a teenager as a way to rank his female classmates based on hotness. The site's popularity spread over the globe, powered by computers and then data centers and server farms sprinkled by the dozens in small towns with lax regulations. Hands in places like China, the Philippines, Vietnam forged the tubes and the wires and the cables that kept the machines running and the data centers humming, belching their heat into the air. The wealth that those hands created flowed into the CEO's bank accounts, allowing him to buy up the land that became his estate, the one where the tall gardener worked. On the day the gardener spilled the contents of his jar, the trees were on their 5th year of growth, almost ready to bear what they'd been specially imported from Australia to make. Thick green pods of waxy nuts for the cows in the neighboring field, a herd of bewildered creatures imported from Japan. A single cow consumed thousands of pounds a year, and it would take 45 macadamia trees to feed just one of the bovines. Networks of metal pipes thrust through the soil, bringing enough water for the trees and for the thirsty cows themselves. Around the cows, the fences hummed with electricity, made with petroleum that workers had drilled out of the earth in places like Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Many of these oil workers would later return to their homes in the Philippines or India, lungs riddled with disease or bodies burned from chemical spills. The gardener whispered words into the ground before he tucked the jar into his pocket and walked away. There was nothing obvious in what he sprinkled there. Fragments of bones from the birds that had once fed on the worms that wriggled in the black dirt. Crystallized ginger from the last plant rescued and kept alive since his great-grandfather's time. Shards of bamboo grown from this soil that had formed the walls of his great-grandfather's tiny holiday hut. Remember what used to grow here, the tall gardener half chanted, half sang. What this land used to serve instead of what it's now been tortured into, and imagine what it could become. He caressed the bark of the alien trees, their fruit named after a white explorer whose name was Macadam. The gardening crew was mostly native, and they'd warned the CEO's estate manager 5 years before that the trees would need to be mulched properly with the husks from neighboring trees. Fertilizers gave a short-term boost, the tall gardener himself had warned, but long-term use would risk depleting the soil, still in recovery from its decades of conversion to sugarcane fields. The advice had all been rejected as too labor-intensive, and the trees had been fed with fertilizer in plastic bags. The gardener told each of them, "You don't belong here, but it isn't your fault." Unseen networks branched and split and joined again under his feet, networks that carried, among many things, water and nutrients to the trees and to the host of organisms rustling there. "Remember," he sang as he fed them with remnants from decades before. He prodded the other 2 native islanders on the crew for stories of when this soil had fed its own, had been nourished by the sweat of those whom it fed, and by the rotting remains of what it had grown. The electricity crackled as the sunset came, and that night a quarter moon shone over the guard station, and the imported trees began to stretch their limbs. By dawn, every one of them stood an inch taller than it had before, and another inch taller that night. And no one saw. Not the next night, or the next, as they reached higher into the sky and the air. No one heard the furious humming beneath the soil, the connections knitting themselves, fairly hissing with fury as they began to remember and to imagine and to dream. It was a muggy afternoon, maybe a month after the gardener's afternoon visit. Inside the CEO's house, the air conditioning roared softly in each room, powered by electricity from more imported petroleum. The housekeepers, 2 from the Philippines, 2 from China, 1 from half a mile down the road, were busy scrubbing and polishing their knees and their backs, singing 5 different songs of pain. The kitchen staff were preparing the CEO's lunch, a simple meal of quinoa from Peru, blueberries from Oregon, and acai berries from Brazil. There were berries grown just down the road, but the kitchen staff were not allowed to buy them, as they cost 25 cents more per pound. The tree-tending gardeners heard it first. It sounded like an urgent call from the house, one of the housekeepers crying for help. They abandoned the field and their tools, and so they didn't see it begin. Not that they would have believed their eyes if they had. Well, one of them would have. The gardeners followed the calls all the way to the house, to the largest of the 3 side porches, the one surrounded by a clump of magnolia trees whose leaves seemed almost to be whispering in the breeze. Every member of the house's staff was gathered there, everyone staring at everyone else. The gardeners had heard the house staff calling, the house staff had heard the outside staff had heard the gardeners. In the buzz of confusion, they began to hear it approaching the house, a dull roar growing louder the closer it came. The dull roar was the macadamia trees. the bespoke ones imported from Australia 5 years before for the sole purpose of creating what the CEO bragged would be the most luxurious beef in the world. 5 years of furious contorting and twisting, trying to fit into soil where they did not belong. They had been growing taller and wider for weeks, and now they seemed to expand by the second with every lumbering step. Now they pulled themselves out of the earth and assembled themselves in messy rows, thundering over the soil, dragging their roots behind them in long trails. They first reached the electrified fence, and in a single burst of current, every electric wire on the place shorted and died. They then tore the fence's wires and even the posts out from the earth. Some of the metal caught in their branches, and the current ran through their roots along their blossoming crowns. Furious, they lumbered along, their wood now glowing a rich sunset red. "Why the hell did you bring us here?" they might have screamed if human were what they spoke. English human, to be exact. And for what? All this for what? But they would make their feelings known soon enough. When the spreading crowns of the trees reached the house, they knocked aside the walls as though they were styrofoam or bamboo, easy and light, because the walls toppled onto the ground, and now the CEO heard the noise, saw the dust. He pulled the headphones off of his ears, the ones made in a tiny factory in Vietnam that locked its workers inside to prevent theft. He'd been listening to a meditation app urging him to find his own inner peace, his natural calm, and instead he threw the headphones onto the floor as he watched the tree limbs gently pluck away his own personal security guards, setting them onto the ground and then nudging them away from the house, not before tossing their guns hundreds of feet out of reach. He screamed to his housekeepers for help, but they had seen the orchard coming and ran as fast as they could. So he was alone when the last wall of his house came down, and alone when the macadamia trees, his trees on his soil, surrounded him, glowing orange-red, crackling with fury and electricity from their crown to their roots. The investigators tried to piece together the story with the little information they had. The estate's sprawling network of cameras had all died at the same instant from the same surge that had fried out the electric fences and the air conditioning in the big house. Not much more came from questioning the gardeners, house cleaners, kitchen staff. They first interviewed the sous chef, who remembered heading to the porch after hearing a call for help, and then nothing more, until he found himself in a pineapple grove, mute and alone. Everyone's memory began to splinter at nearly the exact same place, as if something had shorted it out or pulled it out by the roots. The signs of something terrible were obvious and clear. The electric fence ripped from the ground, the house turned into rubble, roof tiles scattered in circles like a fairy ring. But nobody remembered a thing, and definitely not the tall, braided gardener who had fed the soil with memories and dared it to dream. And nobody knew where the CEO had gone. He'd been in the eastern wing of his house, his devices pinging along, but there was no sign of him in the rubble or in the hundreds and hundreds of acres he owned, the pineapple groves and the mango trees, all bearing fruit, picked and watered by dozens of hands, fruit that he owned, whose profits would flow into his coffers. There was no sign of him in the underground bunker that his workers had been building for months, each of them signing non-disclosure agreements before being paid in one day what the CEO's wealth earned for him in 3 seconds. No sign of him in the groves of macadamia trees, the ones that nobody spoke of seeing march toward the walled compound because they did not remember and would not believe their own memories if they had. On the day a few of the gardeners came to collect their belongings, none of them wanted to work there ever again. They walked past the groves of macadamias, leaves rustling in the wind. If a few of them thought the trees seemed a little closer together than they had before, perhaps in rows a little more staggered, they told themselves they were just being ridiculous. 7 months later, the macadamia trees had finally borne fruit, starting with the tallest of them, the one with the diamond-shaped patch on its bark. The soil under it was a richer black than it had been before, the texture more velvety, as if something special were feeding it from below. For the harvest, the CEO's widow had hired a skeleton crew of day laborers from across the island, Nobody local would set foot on the place. The oldest of them was named Rogelio. He was short and thin with a balding head, and he trembled as the lush green pods fell into his basket. He was desperate for this work, despite the cloud of rumors hanging over the place. "Are you sure you want to sell these, ma'am?" Rogelio asked her when she came by to check up on them, the rich black soil under his feet. "Letting them rot won't bring him back," the widow answered, and then her voice trailed off, and she crumbled some of the dirt in her hands. The rumors were that she and the CEO had been trying for a while to start a family, and Rogelio thought of his children, his grandchildren, and felt a pang of sympathy for her and what she would never have. "May I ask you, did you use something special on this soil? Fertilizer, maybe? Compost?" she asked. He shook his head. The macadamia hovered above her, mute and still. At the end of the first day of the harvest, the day laborers waited and waited for the contractor, the truck that would return them to the parking lot where they'd been found. As their hunger grew and annoyance sparked into anger, they began snacking on the macadamias, remarking that they had never tasted any that were this flavorful and rich. When the truck finally came, 2 hours later than promised, the men's faces were flushed from the heat, their water long gone. Rogelio could never explain where he got the courage to do what he did next. He quietly went up to the contractor, the truck still idling as the men all climbed in. The work of their hands lay in boxes all around them. "You need to pay us for the time we were waiting." Plain and simple, and yet a defiance that he never showed. He'd later tell his wife that he had no idea what had gotten into him. The contractor laughed and opened his driver's side door. Then he noticed that 2 of the other laborers, who the contractor could have sworn spoke only Chinese, were climbing back out of the truck bed, their ears tuned to Rogelio's words. On seeing what was causing the holdup, 2 more of the crew clambered down. "You need to pay us for the time we were waiting, and it was after 8 hours, so it's overtime." The 4 men around Rogelio nodded their heads, shirts damp with sweat. The truck's air conditioner hummed. "I'll find myself another crew is what I'll do," the contractor shot back, his tone clearly expecting that to be the end of it. Instead, he saw the last 3 of the day laborers climb out of the truck bed and surround him, listening, their eyes locked on Rogelio as he spoke. "Nobody on this island's going to touch you after we're done telling them about you," Rogelio shot back, and it was like some other version of him was speaking through his mouth. Or more like a ghost, the ghost of his own younger self, from the time he'd tried to organize a union so long ago it was like another life. Where had this ghost come from? Who or what had conjured him up? Rogelio stared at the fields all around them, imagining the hands that had forged those pipes, that had laid them in the soil. The hands that had nestled the saplings into the ground, the hands that had tended them and pruned the trees and that had harvested what was lying in boxes at their feet. He imagined those hands, all of them, clenching into fists. The laborers waited. The contractor waited. The air conditioning hummed. In front of those immobile faces, the contractor's hands shot into his wallet, and he counted out everyone's pay, adding 2 hours' worth to each stack of bills, calculated a time and a half. Rogelio nodded, and the men climbed into the bed of the truck. When the contractor dropped them off, Rogelio added, "And tomorrow you pay us in advance." The contractor didn't nod, didn't agree, but they all knew that's what he would do. The rest of the harvest went on without incident. The green pods were removed, the nuts packed into containers at a yield of roughly 100 pounds per tree. The largest, the one with the diamond-shaped mark, yielded nearly twice that, and nobody could explain why. The importer had sold the shipment to a huge international food conglomerate, one that had dodged scandals in years past over rumors of child labor and deforestation. At the airport, a crew of workers loaded the harvest into the belly of a plane, headed for the conglomerate's headquarters, just outside of Chicago. From there, the macadamias would be shipped to factories in Ho Chi Minh City and Enrico, Virginia, Monterrey. They would plump up the conglomerate's cookies, white chocolate, peanut butter, chocolate chip, which were packaged in cheerful earth tones and sold to customers around the globe. The harvest would yield enough for thousands of customers, maybe more. The engines hummed and the wheels sped over the tarmac, and the plane lifted into the sky. Thank you.
That was amazing, Cynthia. I think I can safely say none of us have really cheered for macadamia trees that hard before, for sure. And I absolutely loved that you gave us the perspective of the non-native plants and how hard it is for them to adjust to a soil they never meant to be in. That was such a unique take that you brought that out so beautifully. Great story. You do have to tell us, however, when is the Nightmare Box and Other Stories coming out?
Yes. So this is the Nightmare Box and Other Stories. Thank you very much, Nadine, for having your copy there. It is officially out July 9th. Those who went to StokerCon, some of us snagged copies early, but it's officially out July 9th. The press is Cursed Morsels Press. And I will happily put more information on Blue Sky, and on it's also on Cursed Morsels Instagram. So yes, thanks very much.
Is their website the best spot to purchase the collection?
It's always, because it's a small indie press, so it's always best to purchase directly from the press. We're also running a promotion where if you request the Nightmare Box from your local library and send to Instagram or Twitter or anywhere where Cursed Morsels has a social media presence, just send us confirmation that you asked your library to carry the Nightmare Box, and we enter you into a drawing for your own copy. So
I'm so glad I asked.
Thanks for asking.
Thank you so much.
You remembered. And thank you, Laura, for putting that. So thank you very much. And I'm very glad I got to debut this story, because it's not coming out in print until August as part of the Eat the Rich anthology.
All right. That was Rich Soil by Cynthia Gómez. One more round of applause. Woo! Mainly from me, because other people probably can't see the screens, but yay! All right, we will move on to our second writer tonight. And our second writer is Nadine Aurora Tabing, who is a writer, designer, and Shiba Inu enthusiast who lives in the Pacific Northwest. Her writing has appeared in Strange Horizons, Reckoning, Flash Fiction Online, Worlds of Possibility, and others. Her writing has been nominated for the Bram Stoker Award and Pushcart Prize. You can find her online at suchnadine.com. And again, we'll be sure to put the link to Such Nadine in the chat box here at Zoom and on the Facebook page. Nadine, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So tonight I'll be reading a short story called An Inherited Taste. And this short story was published last year, also from Cursed Morsels Press. Yeah, thank you, Cynthia. In this anthology, No Trouble at All, which has a lot of short stories about the horror of politeness. And this story was also the one that was a finalist for the Bram Stoker Award this year. Some content warnings. This story does contain domestic violence and emotional and psychological abuse. An Inherited Taste. When Felicia was born, Bea wept with relief. The weight of her family's sorrow had been growing for some time without anyone to carry it but herself. So, with care, Bea started early. She salted Felicia's milk and formula with murmured complaints. She pureed bananas and seasoned them with sparkling shreds of spite. She stewed potatoes and peas with stubborn little grudges, acidic, which also helped keep them well in their containers and made only little hisses when she unscrewed the jar lids to ladle their contents onto plastic blue spoons. It was how Bea was raised herself, just a touch of rancor at a time. She'd squirmed through years of spoonfuls droning down her throat, and was rewarded now with a palate so fortified she could bear even the most bitter grievances with an easy laugh. Her husband, not so carefully weaned, couldn't stomach even the smallest disappointments. A bypass promotion, a coworker who laughed too loudly, the engine light flickering in the car, a stubbed toe, his steak overdone on one end. His troubles made him slow, heavy, tired. On their first date, that first time he grumbled to her across the table about some old ex, she opened her mouth to take a brief, deep breath. The lingering boil of his anger laid a grease on her tongue, which she swallowed alongside a mouthful of wine, hiding any residue behind a smile. He blinked. He straightened and rubbed his shoulders with obvious awe at their sudden lightness. You see, her mother had said, when Bea told her he scheduled a second date, you're all set now, Anak, for a cheaper price than school, and look, not even your father was able to give me this. A white house, a white fence, a large white car whose creamy leather seats purred and heated, and yet even with all that, her husband needed her more, just as Bea's mother had always hoped for her. Traffic, slow internet, delayed work projects, taxes, bills. He couldn't get through it all alone. Every day the complaints were different, but they always tasted the same. Bea took them all, gnashed them to a paste while she cooed. Over the years, she acclimated to it. Her throat hardly burned anymore, her stomach hardly ached. She felt only the brush of rattling heat against her teeth, which she made herself bear with a calm smile. Then one day, his bonus didn't come, and an outside agency was given ownership of his project. And they stopped serving ramen in the cafeteria, and a client side-eyed his tie, which he later found grease on, grease that Bea should have seen and cleaned for him. Because what else was she doing all day? Didn't she care that he could lose his job because of this? His whole career? Felicia was watching, with wide eyes from behind Bea's legs. She'd grown tall enough now that her little fingers could curl into the back of Bea's knees. Your tie? Oh no, I'm so sorry I missed that. Here, I'll fix it for you. Bea held out her hand. He yanked his tie from around his neck, balled it up, and threw it at her, missing her hand completely. Felicia dashed to pick it up, but before she could, Bea snatched both it and Felicia into her arms. Then she walked upstairs, slowly, calmly, as her husband's voice swelled and rattled the walls. It's all right, Bea murmured to Felicia, but it wasn't necessary. Felicia's eyes were dry, her expression pensive, as if puzzling over something new. She'd already learned to swallow her own tears before her father could hear them and come storming in to silence her with petulant roars about the peace he needed after a long workday. In the laundry room, Bea swabbed and scrubbed the tie with a thumbprint of pale detergent, then took her time looping it over a hanger to dry, taking as long as she could. Once some interval of quiet passed, she led Felicia back downstairs, where she poured a small cup of chocolate milk that Felicia drank without even a flicker of distress at the flung bowls and spilled stew that littered the kitchen. Bea felt a stirring in her, something new, a strange little sharpness of hope. You are so strong, she told Felicia, clutching her close once the mopping was done. Stronger than him, stronger even than me. More than that, Felicia was hungry. She crunched carrots and apple slices as she sat on the counter, legs swinging. As Bea cooked, she spared Felicia the best bites of breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Bea had suffocated her own aspirations for the privilege of this beautiful house. Her old hopes for her future were too much to support along her husband's abundance of calamities. She told Felicia about each one of those hopes, her own choicest morsels. A degree in landscape architecture, a side gig singing, even one saccharine daydream of opening a shop to sell only made-from-scratch macarons. All were pried out stinging, and Felicia was eager to hear each one, her hands reaching. Tell me more, Felicia said, and Bea, indulgent, continued. She told her of the recipes she inherited and kept hidden away because her husband hated the smell of vinegar and fish sauce. Tell me more, Felicia said, and Bea, hesitant, continued. She told her of the friend she'd lost and was forbidden to see again, each name a rancid tang. Jan, who'd said, a white house isn't worth this. Skylar, who'd asked, and eating someone else's sorrows, that's all you think you're good for? Tell me more, Felicia said. Tell me more. And Bea tried. She tried. There was so much more yet. The mornings she woke alone, the years of sidelong thoughts she had not been able to share with anyone, the fact that she had always wanted a house that was green. But Bea could not release any of these. She only coughed, struggling for breath around the knot in her throat. That was the problem with swallowing sorrows. When they were lodged too deep, it was hard to push them out again. Eyes watering, Bea gazed at Felicia and found she could not disgorge her deepest and first sadness, forced between her teeth and planted in the pit of her stomach soon after she was born. My mother said this was how it always was for her, and so how it always would be for me. She said this is what's needed to survive a world ruled by unhappy men, and I always accepted it. But now came a newer sorrow. I don't want this fate to be yours. It was slick and sour, the sharpest sadness she'd ever tasted. Even after years of experience, Bea couldn't make it go down. It kept heaving up so that when her husband came home, fuming about lazy coworkers, she could only barely manage to say, "That's awful. You don't deserve that. No one deserves that." She couldn't make it sound the way that it needed to. His eyes fixed on her immediately. "You don't mean that." "I do," Bea said, and then again, forcing her tongue through a thickness, "I do." Felicia watched, silent, chewing her thumb, absorbing, just as Bea had when she was young, hanging on to the tranquil lilt of her own mother's words, memorizing and tracing the way she bent backwards to every frustration. Bea's mother had survived, and all it took was chewing through years of cleaning, cooking, laughing when no one thought she could understand the muttered gossip about her being nothing more than a mail-order bride, arriving all packaged up and shiny with all the necessary accoutrements, knowledge of how to cook red meat, how to inflate an ego, how to drain depression. She'd survived in a space small and hard and cramped, no wider than the breadth of a smile. Felicia would grow up smiling for different reasons. She had to. She had to. Bea would make sure of it. The next morning, she packed their clothes, enough to cover a week on the run. She had no money to bring, but she'd had skill enough to figure out this life. She could figure out another one, couldn't she? For the first time she could remember, she felt a stab of something in her chest that was hot and hopeful. She was reckless. She pulled out of the driveway and stared at the sky, breathless with how vast it looked suddenly, how endless, and how light she felt, having abandoned in that White House her every anguish and resentment. How many years had she thought her dragging feet and short breath was simply what living felt like? How long had she nursed all of that in her, devouring her and her husband's misfortunes both, so that only he had the freedom to move like this? But when they made it to the highway, Felicia began to whine, loudly, and only kept getting louder. She thrashed in the car seat. She clutched her belly. She screamed, "Mama, I'm hungry." There was a rest stop not far ahead. Bea peeled into the parking lot and clawed through the luggage, murmuring urgently, unraveling plastic wrap, unscrewing a thermos. But Felicia would not be sated by sandwiches or crackers or petty worry, not even by the stress that frothed up in Bea's chest when passerby began to stare. Felicia swatted away the spoon her mother leveled before her mouth, splattering sauce on the car's leather seats. She continued to sob, inconsolable, starving. She only calmed when Bea's hands lowered with pained resignation. Bea turned the car back. She pulled into the house's white garage, dabbed the leather seats in desperation, unpacked her life back into its cage. Felicia's tears dried. "The car's parked too close to the door," her husband said when he came home. Even expecting his suspicion, having spent the past hour steeling herself for it, Bea cringed. "It's not grocery day," he continued, low. "Where did you go?" "Nowhere," Bea wanted to say, but he would have checked the gas level. She said, "We ran out of steak." It was plausible. She was already in the process of tenderizing dinner to hide her shaking hands. She had never lied to him before, had never risked it. She buried and armored herself in his disquiet, learned the borders of his temper, retreated when necessary, and never trespassed far enough to give him reason to do more than raise his voice. But now, God, if he made a move towards Felicia, Bea's ready. Bea was ready. She could take this tenderizer and be sure to buy enough next time, he said finally. It's a waste of gas, and I don't want to have to keep remembering things for you. I have enough to worry about. God, the day I had. He kept going. No shouts, no demands. He was letting her off the hook. Odd, she could hardly listen, and so when he paused and waited for her to dole out her usual comforts, Bea fumbled. I'm so sorry, Papa, Felicia volunteered. That's awful. Both parents looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. That's right, Bea's husband said. It is awful. You get it, Felicia. And before Bea could think of some strategy to stop him, he went on. You know what else? I'm positive one of those assholes filed a complaint against me. Oh no, Felicia said, nearing him, eyes wide. Oh no is right. That's the third complaint on my record now. What do you think that'll look like on my performance review? Felicia licked her lips. Bad? That's right, fucking bad. I could lose my job. I could lose my whole career. And then where will you be, huh? You and your mom, useless here at home, not knowing anything about how to survive in this world. He went on. He didn't hold back, not even to a child. But Felicia was nodding and leaning and reaching out. And then her father took her into his arms, jogging her, pacing, all the while ranting and ranting and ranting. As Bea watched, Felicia wrapped her arms around his neck and rested her head against him, eyes shut, relishing. Bea felt her husband's misery radiate against her lips, that heat, that bite. As she had countless times before, she opened her mouth and felt his fury coil into the pit of her stomach, pungent, salted, like something fermented, cabbage or radish or something with crunch, so fresh that when she laid a hand on her belly, she could almost feel it squirm. She didn't fight as she always had. She took a breath, let herself relax, let herself digest for just a moment. Fucking exhausting, her husband was saying. I'm sick of this. I'm sick of feeling this way. God, why am I the only one that ever feels this way? Neither of you ever lift a finger to help me. I can't handle this. I can't. For the first time, Bea saw that perhaps he really couldn't. He was slumping with the weight of it, more sorrows than any one person could possibly bear. It must be so hard, Bea said, that you're going to be trapped forever in some miserable company. If not this one, then the next or the next, working so hard and still never having enough to retire. He looked up at her, agape, eyes dark. What are you saying? That's what I hear all the time. On the news while I'm cooking, the recession coming, all the layoffs, and everyone saying that it's just a way for these awful companies to make you scared enough, not just to stay, but to give up your whole life for them. He stared at her. Felicia clutched him as his arms slackened. Bea took Felicia from him, kissed him, held his hand, guided him to the dining table, gave him his steak and his wine. But don't think about that too much. There's really nothing you can do about it. And don't let it get to your head. They're saying stress is the new smoking. It's just as dangerous. That'll get you sooner than anything else nowadays. His first glass went fast. Bea poured him another, which Felicia helpfully pushed closer to him until his fist unclenched to take it. I can't handle this, he said toward the distance. I can't. Bea dragged up a chair beside him. Gently, she set Felicia down on his lap, where she leaned against him and set her ear against his beating heart. Inhaling, chewing delicately, savoring. Together, they smiled as Bea patted his back, as she murmured into his ear. Go on, darling. Tell us more. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Nadine. I feel as though I have feasted on both of these stories tonight. the amount of double meanings in like every single phrase in the story, which is the nature of it being about sorrow eaters, is just amazing. Like when you had just the line, Felicia learned how to swallow her own tears. There's just so much that you can get out of so many of your phrases. Wonderfully done. And I know, as often the case in Story Hour, I feel as though we do have a shared theme between two of these stories, which is that we are definitely rooting for what would be the traditional monsters in the stories, because you both have done such a wonderful job of exposing the real monsters. They very, very well complemented each other, I think. Nadine, do you have any upcoming publications to tell us about, or anything else? Tell us what you're working on next.
I don't have many upcoming publications, but I did have a recent story out last April in Worlds of Possibility, which is about it's like a cozy cyberpunk thing. So not quite like this, but it's about kind of like body parts that are inherited through different generations of a family, called Inheritance in 6 Parts. And that's in the April 2024 Worlds of Possibility.
That sounds amazing. What a clever title.
Thank you. It's all about inheritance with me.
All right. Well, thank you, Nadine, and thank you, Cynthia, for sharing your stories with us. Next week at 7 p.m. Pacific time, June 26th, our readers will be Annika Baronti-Klein and Maggie Slater. Make sure that you check out storyhour2020.com on the day of the reading, just in case the schedule gets changed or there's some sort of announcement that comes up. You can also learn more about our upcoming authors there. And if you have missed any Story Hours in the past, you can find each episode on the Story Hour Facebook page. I also want to say thank you to Daniel Marcus and Laura Blockwell for having me guest host tonight. And also, thank you to the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association for the Givers Fund grant that keeps Story Hour streaming. Thank you to everyone who joined us tonight around this virtual campfire, and I hope you had some real s'mores to go along with the stories. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you for coming.